Gravel cut bare feet as Emily Carter ran through the orchard road, under a moon, cold as bone. Shadows broke apart like shutters in a storm. Emily said, "Do not look back." Branches clawed and the bell from the chapel tolled once, iron and final. Lucas Ward's flashlight carved spears through fog, and his orders cracked like whips. Lucas Ward said, "Return, and mercy follows." Mercy felt like a collar tightening. The wind carried chanting from the hall, a bruise of sound. Emily saw the fence high and dark, and counted 3 breaths. Father Malachi Hayes stepped from the trees, voice velvet. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Come home, child." The word home shook like a trap. Emily tasted rust, then chose the thorns. Dawn found a muddy creek where Emily washed the gravel from torn soles. The creek sounded like a clock. Emily said, "Keep moving." Birds started, then hushed as a truck rumbled far off. Memory pressed in, heavy and ordered. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Pain is proof of love." The phrase fit like barbed wire. Lucas Ward's lessons turned kindness into obedience drills. Sarah Carter smiled with eyes that begged. Sarah Carter said, "Please listen, they will help us." Help became a cage with hymns for bars. Emily packed silence into her lungs and followed the water. The hall had long tables and bowls, lined like soldiers. Discipline lived in the gaps between breaths. Father Malachi Hayes said silence makes room for truth. Spoons moved in perfect rhythm, a metronome of surrender. Lucas Ward paced the aisle, boots counting sins. Emily watched the innocent trace patterns in soup. "Noah Reed," said they, "said the stars live in the ceiling." The ceiling was painted with false skies. Sarah Carter squeezed Emily's hand, then withdrew under a glance. All was rationed, then taxed. Evening doctrine gathered like storm clouds. Father Malachi Hayes raised a hand, and the room stilled. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Suffering is a door, step through and find light." Light hung from a single bulb, trembling. Lucas Ward wrote names on a board, chalk biting. Emily felt her name hover there. Sarah Carter said, "Do not draw notice." The silent one at the back breathed like paper. Jonah Price said nothing, but his stare asked a question with no safe answer. Fear measured the distance to the exit. Night returned with a colder silence. Footsteps circled the compound like wolves pretending to prey. Lucas Ward said lights out means hearts open. Hearts shut tight instead. Emily counted knots in the bunk frame. Sarah Carter whispered a hymn, sweet and cracked. Father Malachi Hayes said dreams teach obedience. Dreams taught escape routes. Jonah Price stood in the corridor and watched the dark breathe. The dark watched back. Emily mapped the fence in her mind and waited for the bell to sleep. Before the orchard nights, Emily carried a suitcase of small hopes and a letter that promised a home. The city felt loud with doors that never opened. Emily said, "I can be useful if someone shows me how." A flyer found her at dawn, soft paper with warm words. Sarah met her at a Kafuzarowanine and spoke of meals, work, and harmony. Sarah Carter said, "You will be seen here." Father Malachi Hayes greeted her like a pastor in a postcard. Father Malachi Hayes said, "You were guided to us." Lucas Ward stood nearby, quiet and precise. The table smelled of cinnamon and faith. Emily believed the scent. The door closed with a chime that sounded like a bell. The first gathering felt like a blanket laid on cold ground. Voices rose and folded like waves. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Love is labor shaped into song." They sang and clapped with measured joy. Emily traced the rhythm and let it hold her stillness. Lucas Ward said, "Order builds trust." He moved the chairs until they obeyed the grid. Sarah passed bread and touched Emily at 2019's shoulder. Sarah Carter said, "You belong already." The word belong opened her chest. Jonah watched from the doorway with winter in his eyes. The ceiling fan beat time with the chorus. Emily thought the air itself agreed. Sarah walked Emily through the dorm and named each rule like a lullaby. Silence after lights. Eyes down during prayer. Sarah Carter said, "Structure makes hurt quiet." Emily nodded and counted the beats between lamps. Lucas Ward appeared at corners like a metronome. Lucas Ward said, "Precision honors the gift." The words landed with a tidy click. Emily told a short story about a winter she survived alone. Sarah listened as if collecting glass. Sarah Carter said, "No one is alone now." The promise felt stitched, then pulled tight. The corridor smelled of soap and iron. Keys jingled like little verdicts. In the garden, a child traced stars in dirt and asked where the sky sleeps. Noah Reed said, "Do they hear us when we sing?" Emily felt her voice soften. Emily said, "Maybe the sky listens when we are kind." Father Malachi Hayes arrived with a bowl of apples and approval. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Teach with gentleness, correct with truth." The phrase wore velvet gloves. Lucas Ward watched the gate and wrote names in a notebook. Sarah smiled like summer and passed a ribbon to Noah. Sarah Carter said, "Tie hope to a branch." The branch bent under the ribbon and kept bending. Supper felt like a story told with steam and bowls. Laughter arrived on cue, light and rehearsed. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Family is the shape of salvation." The sentence curled around the table like incense. Lucas Ward counted plates and measured silence. Sarah poured tea and brushed Emily a 2019 sleeve. Sarah Carter said, "Eat, rest, and let the noise fade." Jonah sat across and studied the window as if it might open. Noah swung his feet and hummed a small tune. Emily let warmth climb her ribs. The room glowed like a promise set to low flame. Dawn drills began before the birds learned the song of light. Rows formed, bowls aligned, and eyes lowered on command. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Order is love practiced without vanity." The sentence fit every inch of floor like tape. Lucas Ward paced the grid and counted breaths to 4. Lucas Ward said, "Breathe on my count or breathe alone." Alone meant shame and a seat near the door. Sarah Carter rehearsed smiles until they did not shake. Sarah Carter said, "Steady hands, steady hearts." Jonah Price watched the metronome of movement and did not blink. Emily kept time, then felt the beat bruise the ribs of her will. The mistake was a spoon set half an inch off center. Silence rang harder than any bell. Lucas Ward said, "Deviation, ripples like rot." The word rot crawled under skin and nested there. Emily fixed the spoon, but the ritual demanded more. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Correction is mercy witnessed by all." Mercy felt like frost on a tongue. Sarah Carter said, "Take the stillness posture." The floor cooled Emily's knees and taught them obedience. Jonah Price studied the window and measured the cost. Noah hummed a thin note that trembled into hush. Emily held the pose until the room forgot she could move. Afternoon duties came with notebooks and eyes that never blinked in time. Lucas Ward said, "Account for every kindness and every failure." Kindness joined the ledger like a debt. Emily sorted herbs and counted the leaves twice. Sarah Carter said, "Write what you witness, even if it is love." Love became a report with tight margins. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Transparency protects the soul from vanity." Vanity tasted like fear with sugar on it. Jonah Price hovered by the door as if shadow had wages. A whisper moved along the benches like smoke. Emily felt the smoke look for a spark and called herself no one. Evening lessons turned discipline into lullaby for small bodies. Noah Reed traced letters while the room weighed his breath. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Reverence grows when noise is pruned." Pruned sounded gentle until the scissors clicked. Lucas Ward tapped a ruler near the bench of waiting. Lucas Ward said, "Sit until silence returns to you." Silence arrived like a stone in a pocket. Sarah Carter said, We will sing once the stillness is strong. The song backed away into the hallway and would not return. Jonah Price stared at the door and saw a door. Emily counted to 50 and offered Noah a smile that did not betray him. Night patrol thinned, and the walls learned to breathe slower. Ava Brooks stepped from the dark with a look that cut through ritual. Ava Brooks said, "There is a gate no one watches after third bell." The words carried risk like fire wrapped in paper. Emily swallowed the flame and hid it under a quiet nod. Jonah Price did not move, but his eyes shifted a fraction. Sarah Carter said, "Sleep comes when we surrender the day." Surrender felt like walking backward off a cliff. Lucas Ward's radio hissed, and then went still. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Peace rests on those who obey." Emily folded the map in her mind and waited for the clock to falter. The chapel smelled of wax and damp wood, but beneath the scent lay something sour. Emily noticed Father Malachi Hayes pause before the altar, his eyes sliding to a locked chest at his feet. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Faith is a treasure that must be guarded." Yet, the key never left his pocket. Sarah Carter whispered a verse with her lips trembling. Sarah Carter said, "His words feel different tonight." Lucas Ward stood by the chest, his hands clenched like a soldier's. Lucas Ward said, "Protection requires vigilance." Jonah Price watched, eyes narrowing as if he knew the weight of secrets. Emily felt the chants echo too hollow, like a stage with painted skies. Morning revealed a hall filled with offerings, baskets stacked higher than children. Father Malachi Hayes raised his hands, smiling like a merchant. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Your sacrifice feeds the sacred flame." Coins clinked like shackles in jars. Emily glanced at Sarah, who tried to mask her unease. Sarah Carter said, "He counts every seed and every soul." Lucas Ward guarded the line, eyes sharp, ledger in hand. Jonah Price muttered a prayer that sounded hollow. Jonah Price said, "Faith should not weigh like gold." The words were lost in the clatter. Emily felt the truth slip beneath her ribs. This was not salvation, it was trade. The betrayal came as softly as a hymn. Sarah held Emily's hand, her voice low. Sarah Carter said, "Forgive me, I cannot carry you anymore." Her eyes wet, yet her grip unshaken. Emily whispered, "You chose them." The sound split the air like glass. Lucas Ward seized her arm as if rehearsed. Lucas Ward said, "She will learn obedience again." Father Malachi Hayes stood above, nodding with solemn pride. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Sacrifice proves loyalty." Jonah Price turned away, his shoulders sagging with shame. Emily felt Sarah's warmth fade, replaced by iron. Trust cracked like a bone under boot. Silence had a new edge when Jonah slipped into the corner, carrying nothing but a paper scrap. He pressed it into Emily's palm when no eyes watched. Jonah Price whispered, "Not all doors are locked." The paper bore a map sketched in hurried lines. Emily closed her hand, the ink smudging into her skin. Sarah turned away, her hymn louder, covering the exchange. Sarah Carter said, "Praise the light," though her tone cracked. Lucas Ward's boots echoed near, his suspicion heavy. Lucas Ward said, "Truth hides in silence." Father Malachi Hayes raised a prayer, but Emily heard only the map's promise. Night fell with chants that smothered air, every word a chain. Emily stared at the gate drawn on the scrap, the ink fading where sweat had bled it. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Escape is death, loyalty is eternal life." His words thundered like iron. Lucas Ward stood guard, his flashlight slicing the dark. Sarah sang louder, her voice cracking like glass under weight. Jonah Price prayed with fists clenched. Jonah Price said, "God forgive me for seeing and doing nothing." Emily felt Ava Brooks' whisper return. There was a way. The choice pulsed like a wound. Freedom would cost more than chains ever had. Night pressed close as the third bell died in the fog. Emily traced the map in memory and counted breaths. Ava Brooks drifted from shadow to shadow with a hunter's hush. Ava Brooks said, "Wait for the beam to sweep right." The flashlight carved a white blade along the fence and moved on. Lucas Ward listened to the radio like it was a pulse. Lucas Ward said, "Report in 10. Sarah Carter stood at the chapel door and sang to hide a tremor. Sarah Carter said, "Hold to the light." Father Malachi Hayes blessed the courtyard with a hand raised high. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Peace upon obedience." Jonah Price kept to the eaves and watched the pattern of steps. Emily felt the gate breathe when the hinge clicked in the wind. She mouthed a prayer to no one and pressed forward. The gravel made a soft storm beneath careful feet. Ava lifted 2 fingers and cut the air. The moment opened like a seam. The lock yielded a whisper, and then a dare. Ava Brooks said, 3 seconds, then go. Emily slid through the gap with the ache of a held breath. The chant from the hall rose like a tide against rock. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Tonight we are remade." The word remade scraped like a file. Lucas Ward turned, nose to the wind, and the radio clicked twice. Lucas Ward said, "Unit 2, sweep north." Sarah Carter stepped from the door and saw the impossible shape of choice. Sarah Carter said, "Please, do not be seen." Jonah Price held the corner and watched courage borrow his hands. Emily gripped the paper scrap and felt it melt with sweat. The yard expanded and then snapped tight. Ava pushed her forward into a slice of black between sheds. The world narrowed to the sound of hinges not crying. A siren slept in the radio until a word woke it. Lucas Ward said, "Gate disturbance." The syllables cracked and scattered pigeons from the roof. Emily ran bent low, counting posts like prayers. Ava Brooks said, "Left," then straight to the orchard break. The ground tilted and found her ankles with hunger. Sarah Carter stepped into shadow and pressed a hymn against her mouth. Sarah Carter said, "Forgive me to the night." Father Malachi Hayes lifted both arms and the chant climbed a pitch. Father Malachi Hayes said, "The stray returns by the leash." Jonah Price moved into the path and let his body become a wall. Jonah Price said, "Not this time." Emily felt the air close behind her like a door, and still she moved. The fence line showed a darker seam that promised teeth and sky. The orchard broke into a ragged corridor of branches. Emily slid through thorn and smoke of breath. Ava Brooks said, "Fence cut is 20 paces." The cut appeared like a mouth trying not to speak. Lucas Ward crashed into the row with rage held on a leash. Lucas Ward said, "Down on the ground." The order hit bark and fell dead. Father Malachi Hayes did not run. He arrived like a sermon with legs. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Kneel, and you will live." Sarah Carter's steps faltered and her song became air. Jonah Price tossed a rock toward the far ditch to bend the hunt. Jonah Price said, "Over here," with a voice borrowed from courage. Emily found the wire seam and threaded herself through pain. The field beyond smelled like rain that belonged to no one. Open field rose like a held breath released. The fence gave a final cry and let Emily through. Ava Brooks said, "Run until the road forgets your name." The wind peeled sweat from skin and turned it into wings. Lucas Ward took aim with a shout that broke in the throat. Lucas Ward said, "Stop, or be stopped." Father Malachi Hayes called out a blessing sharpened to a blade. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Return and be reborn." Sarah Carter stumbled and grabbed the fence with both hands. Sarah Carter said, "Please live." Jonah Price faced the row and waited to be the delay. Jonah Price said, "I am here." Emily felt the ground lift her like a vow. Ahead lay a strip of black that meant road and then sky. She chose the strip and did not look back. The first breath of freedom scraped like smoke in Emily's chest. She stumbled onto the road, gravel cutting into her soles, but the night air felt unchained. Ava Brooks whispered, "Keep going. The world begins past that bend." The trees thinned, the stars wider now, no ceiling painted above. Emily said, It feels wrong to breathe without permission. Jonah Price's absence carried weight, his silence echoing louder than shouts. Sarah Carter's song lingered behind like a ghost too close to follow. Father Malachi Hayes' voice haunted the marrow. Father Malachi Hayes said, "Chains are eternal when worn in the mind." Lucas Ward's boots no longer struck behind, but memory made them march. Emily's steps shook yet found rhythm, the road offering no questions. The woods opened into a hollow field where silence replaced pursuit. Emily collapsed against a log, hands trembling like strings cut. Ava Brooks said, "You made it through the teeth." Emily laughed, but the sound broke like glass. Emily said, "I left more than I carried." The weight of faces pressed into her. Sarah Carter's fractured faith, Jonah Price's sacrifice. The night pressed her ribs, not letting them rise. Emily remembered Noah Reed's quiet hum. A child tracing stars on paper. The thought knifed sharper than fences. Father Malachi Hayes' sermons bled back in, telling her she would never belong beyond the gates. Yet the wind pulled her hair free, and the stars above burned without chains. By noon the road carried sound again. An engine, cautious, deliberate. A truck slowed, dust rising behind it like ghosts. A man leaned out, his voice rough with distance. David Miller said, "Do you need help?" Emily froze, eyes darting to Ava. Ava Brooks said, "Trust breaks slower than bones." Emily's throat cracked when she answered. Emily said, "We need to be anywhere but here." The truck bed smelled of diesel and dirt, yet it was not the chapel. Emily's ribs ached when she climbed in, her hands clutching splinters like relics. Jonah Price's last stand replayed with every turn of the wheels. Sarah Carter's song replayed too, louder now, almost pleading. Freedom tasted like rust, but it was still air. The outsider's home was not sanctuary, but it was not a prison. The kitchen smelled of coffee, unfamiliar and bitter, not hymns. David Miller said, "You'll need to tell someone, or it will follow." Emily shook her head, her voice thin. Emily said, "It already follows." Ava Brooks stared at the window blinds, her jaw clenched, as if waiting for boots. Silence filled the corners where sermons used to sit. Jonah Price's shadow lingered near the door, a ghost uninvited, yet present. Sarah Carter's face lingered with a broken hymn. Father Malachi Hayes' echo whispered that sin never leaves. Lucas Ward's glare pulsed behind her eyelids when she closed them. Emily wrapped her hands around the mug, burning palms just to feel something real. Night returned, and freedom weighed heavier than chains. Emily lay awake on a stranger's couch, the ceiling unknown. Dreams came, but they were not gentle. They chanted in Father Malachi Hayes' voice. Father Malachi Hayes said, "You cannot wash the mark away." Emily bolted upright, her chest pounding like fists on doors. Ava Brooks whispered from the floor, "It doesn't end just because we left." The words carved truth deeper. Emily whispered, "Then we carry it until it kills or fades." The house creaked, but every sound felt like boots in halls. Sarah Carter's voice returned in fragments of hymn. Jonah Price's sacrifice pressed like an anchor. Emily touched her scars and let the silence admit it. Chains can break, but shadows remain. Morning laid a thin gold skin over the town, and quiet finally had room to breathe. Emily walked along a river path where reeds bowed like listeners. Emily said, "Silence is not the same as safety." Ava Brooks kept pace, eyes on the water's slow grammar. Ava Brooks said, "We write a new sentence with every step." Memory pushed back, heavy as wet cloth, yet her lungs kept time. David Miller met them at the bend and nodded without questions. David Miller said, "There's coffee and a phone if you want it." Emily held the word "want" as if it might burn. She looked at the horizon and let the morning keep its promise. News reached them in fragments as if truth feared a full shape. A report said the hall was sealed, but the songs still leaked through memory. Emily said, "A lock on wood is not a lock on a mind." Ava Brooks scrolled, jaw set, searching for names that mattered. Ava Brooks said, "We need Noah Reed's name on a safe list." The room thinned around that single wish. David Miller called a contact who promised a search. David Miller said, "We will keep asking until someone answers." Emily whispered a line of comfort and felt it fail. The air gathered itself and waited with them. By afternoon, the outsider's voice became a wire thrown over the wall. A journalist met them at a diner and opened a recorder like a door. Claire Nguyen said, "Tell me everything you can carry." Emily let the story walk out, step by step, refusing to run. Emily said, "They sold obedience as love and weighed it in coins." Ava Brooks added the map, the gate, the names not to forget. Ava Brooks said, "Write Jonah Price first." The clink of cups marked each truth set on the table. Claire Nguyen said, "People will listen when the hurt has shape." The hurt found its outline and held. Night pressed against the glass while the broadcast moved across counties. Voices called in with stories that rhymed with theirs. Emily said, "We are not the only echo." On the screen, officials denied and promised in the same breath. Ah. Ava Brooks said, "Denial has a schedule and an end." David Miller checked the locks, then sat where he could see both doors. David Miller said, "If they come, we're not alone this time." The house listened and learned their names. Emily folded a blanket and found her hands were steady. The dark did not leave, but it stepped back. Dawn returned, and with it, a small courage that did not ask permission. Emily walked to the porch and listened to birds claim the gutters. Emily said, "I will not measure my breaths by their rules." Ava Brooks joined her, the quiet strong enough to hold. Ava Brooks said, "We will keep saying the names until the doors stay open." The road waited without judgment. David Miller brought coffee and did not speak. The steam rose like a new hymn with no leash. Emily looked at the horizon and let a final truth settle. Emily said, "I still hear them chanting in my dreams."